Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. When your own family chooses money over your happiness, the world can feel like a cold and lonely place. Sarah May learned this hard truth when she refused to marry a cruel man her father had chosen. Her family threw her out with nothing, leaving her to wander the dangerous frontier roads as night fell. With wolves in the distance and nowhere to go, she knocked on a stranger's door. The battle-scarred cowboy who answered had his own wounds to heal. Neither of them expected that one desperate night would change both their lives forever. Her rejected suitor wasn't going to let her disappear quietly into the wilderness. Would this broken cowboy become her salvation, or would the past catch up to destroy any chance they had at happiness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of coming snow across the Montana territory, whispering through the pines that surrounded Jacob Hartwell's remote cabin. He stood at his kitchen window, coffee cup, warming his weathered hands, watching the sun sink behind the mountains like a dying ember. 43 years old, and most days he felt every one of them in his bones and his soul. Jacob's reflections stared back from the glass-graying hair that had once been black as coal, lines carved deep by weather and worry, and eyes that had seen too much death to ever truly rest easy. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw caught the lamplight, a permanent reminder of Gettysburg and the artillery shell that had taken half his company. But it wasn't the visible scars that kept him awake at night. He turned away from the window and walked to the fireplace, where his worn leather holster hung on a wooden peg. The Colt revolver inside had been his companion for over 20 years, first in the war, then as a lawman, and now in this self-imposed exile where he tried to forget both. The leather was cracked and darkened with age, shaped by thousands of draws and countless miles of hard travel. It represented everything he'd been and everything he was trying not to be anymore. The cabin reflected his solitary existence, functional but sparse, clean but cold. 2 rooms and a loft, built solid with his own hands, after he'd given up on civilization and everything it represented. The furniture was simple, a table he'd carved from pine, 2 chairs, though he never expected company, shelves lined with books that were his only conversation partners. A pot of stew simmered on the wood stove, enough for one man who ate not from hunger but from habit. Jacob had chosen this place deliberately, miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a narrow trail that most folks would miss entirely. After losing everything that mattered in a war that solved nothing, and then losing his purpose as a sheriff in a town that cared more about politics than justice, he'd decided that solitude was safer than hope. Out here, he couldn't disappoint anyone, couldn't fail to protect what mattered, couldn't watch good people suffer while bad men prospered. The silence was broken only by the crackling fire and the occasional call of an owl in the darkness beyond his walls. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet, even found comfort in it most days. But sometimes, like tonight, the silence felt heavy with all the words he'd never get to say to the people he'd failed to save. 20 miles away, Sarah May Thornton stumbled along a rocky path that could barely be called a road. Her blue cotton dress, once her finest, now hung torn and muddy from her desperate flight through brambles and creek beds. The hem was shredded, the sleeves ripped from catching on branches as she'd pushed through the wilderness in growing darkness. This dress had been a gift from her mother for her 17th birthday just 3 months ago back, when she still believed her family loved her more than they loved money. Her shoes, thin leather slippers, meant for parlor floors and church services, had given up their battle against the rough terrain hours ago. Her feet were cut and bleeding, leaving crimson drops on the stones behind her. The temperature was dropping fast, and she had no coat, no food, and no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. The confrontation with her father replayed in her mind with each painful step. Marcus Thornfield, the richest rancher in 3 counties, had arrived that morning with his proposal and his expectation of acceptance. A man of 52 with dead eyes and cruel hands, who'd buried 2 wives already and was shopping for a third. Her father, deep in debt from failed cattle speculation and mounting gambling losses, saw Marcus as salvation rather than the predator he truly was. "You'll marry him, Sarah May, and that's final," her father had declared, not even looking at her as he counted the gold coins Marcus had placed on their kitchen table. "It's a good match. He'll provide for you." "He'll kill me," she'd whispered, remembering the bruises she'd seen on his last wife before the woman died of fever. "I won't do it, Papa. I can't." Her father's hand had struck her cheek so hard she'd tasted blood. "You'll do as you're told, girl. This family needs this marriage, and your wants don't matter a lick." When she'd continued to refuse, when she'd begged her mother to intervene, they'd simply thrown her out. Her own mother had watched from the doorway, tears on her face, but saying nothing as Sarah May was pushed into the yard with only the clothes on her back. No money, no supplies, no horse-and-arthing, but the bitter knowledge that to her family she was nothing more than livestock to be sold to the highest bidder. The path ahead disappeared into thick pines, and Sarah May realized she was truly lost. The temperature continued to drop, and she could see her breath in the moonlight. Wolves howled somewhere in the distance, a sound that made her blood run cold. She'd heard stories of what happened to people caught alone in the wilderness at night, stories that usually didn't have happy endings. Her legs trembled with exhaustion and cold as she forced herself to keep moving. Each step sent pain shooting through her wounded feet, but stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. She thought about her little sister Emma, only 14, who would likely face the same fate when she came of age. Her parents would sell Emma too, unless someone stopped this madness. Through the trees ahead, Sarah May caught sight of something that made her heart leap a faint, flickering light, warm and yellow, like lamplight through a window. She stumbled toward it, hope and desperation driving her forward despite her body's protests. Jacob's cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stand guard over the humble dwelling. Smoke curled from the chimney, and golden light spilled from 2 windows like beacons in the darkness. It was the most beautiful sight Sarah May had ever seen. She approached slowly, suddenly aware of how she must look a wild thing emerging from the woods, torn and bloody and desperate. What kind of man lived all the way out here, so far from civilization? Was he dangerous, a criminal hiding from the law, or worse? But the cold was seeping into her bones, and she could feel her strength fading. Whatever risk the man inside represented, it couldn't be worse than dying alone in the wilderness. She climbed the wooden steps to his porch, raised her trembling hand, and knocked on the door. Inside, Jacob had been preparing for bed when the soft rapping reached his ears. He froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. In the 3 years he'd lived in this cabin, no one had ever come to his door. The trail was too hard to find by accident, and the few people who knew of his existence also knew better than to disturb his solitude. He stood slowly, every instinct honed by years of violence telling him to approach with caution. His hand moved automatically to the gun at his hip before he remembered he'd hung the holster by the fire. For a moment, he considered simply ignoring the visitor, letting whoever it was assume the cabin was empty and move on. But something about the knock-soft, uncertain, desperate made him reconsider. Jacob walked to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. He could hear breathing on the other side, quick and shallow, like someone trying not to cry. Against his better judgment, he lifted the wooden bar and slowly opened the door. The sight that greeted him drove all thoughts of caution from his mind. A young woman stood on his porch, barely more than a girl, torn and bleeding and shivering in the cold night air. Her dress was ruined, her feet bare and cut, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. But it was her eyes that struck him, most blue as a summer sky and filled with a desperate hope that nearly broke his heart. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I got kicked from my family house. Can I sleep here tonight, sir?" Jacob stared at the broken young woman on his doorstep, his mind warring between a lifetime of caution and the sight of someone clearly in desperate need. Every instinct told him to close the door, to protect the solitude he'd worked so hard to build. But looking at her torn dress, her bleeding feet, and the way she swayed on unsteady legs, he couldn't bring himself to turn away someone so obviously in trouble. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was the first time he'd spoken to another human being in months. Sarah May nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that she'd stopped moving, the adrenaline that had carried her through the wilderness was fading, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and pain that seemed to radiate from every part of her body. Jacob looked past her into the darkness, scanning for signs of pursuit or companions. Seeing nothing but empty forest, he stepped aside. "Come in. You're about to freeze to death out there." Relief flooded through Sarah May so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. She stepped across the threshold into warmth that felt like salvation itself. The cabin was simple but clean, filled with the scent of wood smoke and coffee. A fire crackled cheerfully in the stone fireplace, and she moved toward it instinctively, drawn by the promise of heat. Jacob closed the door and barred it, then turned to study his unexpected guest. In the lamplight, he could see that she was even younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 17 or 18. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her shoulders, and dirt streaked her pale cheeks. But beneath the grime and exhaustion, he could see that she'd been well cared for until recently. Her hands were soft, her posture straight despite her weariness. This wasn't a woman accustomed to hardship. "Sit down before you fall down," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs by his small table. Sarah May sank into the chair gratefully, her legs finally giving out. The warmth from the fire began to penetrate her frozen limbs, and with it came a painful tingling sensation that made her gasp. Jacob moved to his wash basin and poured water into a bowl, then grabbed a clean cloth from a shelf. When he turned back, he saw that his guest was staring at the blood-stained handkerchief she'd been clutching, a delicate piece of linen embroidered with her initials, now soaked with blood from where she'd tried to clean her cuts. "Let me see those feet," he said, setting the bowl on the floor beside her chair. Sarah May hesitated, suddenly aware of the impropriety of the situation. A young, unmarried woman alone with a stranger, accepting help in such an intimate way, it would be scandalous if anyone knew. But propriety seemed less important than survival at the moment. She lifted her foot, wincing, as she saw the damage clearly for the first time. Cuts and scrapes covered both feet, with deeper gashes where sharp stones had bitten into her flesh. Several thorns were still embedded in her skin, and everything was caked with dried blood and dirt. Jacob knelt beside her chair and gently took her foot in his hands. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such a large, rough-looking man. He worked in silence, cleaning the wounds with careful precision, removing thorns and debris with steady hands that spoke of experience with such tasks. "What's your name?" he asked as he worked, his voice quiet and non-threatening. "Sarah May," she whispered, then added almost defiantly, "Sarah May Thornton." Jacob's hands stilled for a moment. He knew that Namino personally, but by reputation. The Thorntons owned a large spread about 20 miles southeast, known for their cattle and their social pretensions. Old money, or what passed for it in this part of the territory. What was their daughter doing alone in the wilderness, torn and bleeding? "I'm Jacob," he said, resuming his gentle ministrations. "Jacob Hartwell." He didn't ask what had happened to her, not yet. In his experience, people told their stories when they were ready, and pushing usually made them clam up tighter than a bank vault. Instead, he focused on treating her wounds, wrapping her feet in clean cloth, once he'd done all he could for them. "Thank you," Sarah May said softly as he finished. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't answered the door." Jacob stood and carried the bloody water outside to dump it, needing a moment to think. When he returned, he found Sarah May staring into the fire, her eyes distant and filled with pain that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded, and he ladled stew into a bowl, setting it before her along with a chunk of bread. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her body reminded her how long it had been since her last meal. Jacob poured himself coffee and sat in the other chair, studying her face in the firelight. "You running from something?" he asked finally. Sarah May's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She looked at him over the rim of the bowl, weighing how much to tell this stranger who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. "My family," she said at last. "They wanted me to marry someone, a terrible man. When I refused, they threw me out." Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough of the world to know that families didn't usually cast out their daughters for refusing marriage proposals, not unless there was serious money involved. This man they wanted you to marry. Dangerous. Sarah May's hand trembled as she set down the spoon. "Marcus Thornfield. He's rich and powerful, and he gets what he wants. His last 2 wives died under mysterious circumstances. I think I know he killed them." The name hit Jacob like a physical blow. Marcus Thornfield owned the largest ranch in the territory, with political connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Jacob had heard rumors about the man's ruthlessness, his willingness to use violence to solve problems and intimidation to get his way. If Sarah May had refused him publicly, Thornfield wouldn't simply let it go. Men like that didn't accept rejection. "Does he know where you are?" Jacob asked. "I don't think so. I just ran into the woods and kept going until I found your cabin. But he won't give up looking. He's not the kind of man who accepts no for an answer." Jacob stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. His mind was already working through the implications. If Thornfield came looking for the girl and this cabin wouldn't remain hidden for long. The man had resources, connections, and a reputation for getting what he wanted through any means necessary. "You can't go back," Jacob said, more to himself than to her. "I know." Sarah May's voice was barely a whisper. "But I don't have anywhere else to go. No money, no friends who would dare stand up to Marcus. My own family sold me like a piece of livestock." The pain in her voice stirred something in Jacob's chest that he'd thought long dead. He turned back to look at her, this slip of a girl who'd been betrayed by everyone who should have protected her, sitting in his cabin with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She reminded him of someone else who'd needed protection once, someone he'd failed to save. "You can stay tonight," he said finally. "It's not safe for you to be wandering around in the dark anyway." Relief flooded Sarah May's face. "Just tonight. I promise I'll leave in the morning and won't cause you any trouble." Jacob nodded, though something in his gut told him that morning wouldn't solve their problems. A man like Marcus Thornfield didn't give up easily, and a girl like Sarah May had no defenses against someone with his power and ruthlessness. But those were tomorrow's problems. Tonight, she needed shelter and safety, and despite his better judgment, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. As the fire burned lower and the night grew deeper, neither of them spoke of the wolves howling in the distance, or the fact that some predators walked on 2 legs and were far more dangerous than anything in the wilderness. They sat in quiet companionship, 2 broken souls who'd found temporary shelter from their respective storms, neither knowing that this single night would change both their lives forever. Sarah May fell asleep in the chair by the fire, exhaustion finally claiming her. Jacob covered her with a blanket and settled into the other chair, his gun within easy reach. He didn't expect to sleep much. Old habits from his law enforcement days made him automatically think about security, escape routes, and potential threats. But as he watched Sarah May's peaceful face in the firelight, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought buried with his past. For the first time in 3 years, Jacob Hartwell had something worth protecting again. And that realization scared him more than any physical danger ever could. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, filtering through the cabin windows like weak tea. Jacob woke to find Sarah May still sleeping in the chair by the fireplace. The blanket pulled up to her chin, and her dark hair spread across the worn fabric. In the morning light, she looked even younger than she had the night before. Fragile and vulnerable in a way that made his chest tighten with protective instincts he'd thought long buried. He moved quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire and starting coffee, trying not to wake her. She needed the rest, and he needed time to think about what came next. The smart thing would be to send her on her way with some supplies and directions to the nearest town. But the image of Marcus Thornfield's face haunted him. He'd seen the man once in Billings, and those cold eyes had reminded him of other predators he'd known. Men who took what they wanted and destroyed anyone who stood in their way. Sarah May stirred as the smell of coffee filled the cabin, her eyes opening slowly as she remembered where she was. For a moment, confusion clouded her features. Then memory returned, and with it, the weight of her circumstances. "Good morning," Jacob said softly, pouring coffee into a second cup. "How are the feet?" Sarah May sat up carefully, testing her weight on her bandaged feet. They were stiff and sore, but the sharp pain of the night before had dulled to a manageable ache. "Much better, thank you. I should get moving soon." "Where exactly are you planning to go?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah May stared into the fire, her face reflecting the uncertainty that had kept her awake during the few hours she'd actually slept. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe Denver, or San Francisco, somewhere far enough away that Marcus can't find me." "With what money? What supplies? What plan?" His bluntness stung, but Sarah May knew he was right. She had nothing but the torn dress on her back, and no real idea how to survive on her own. She'd been raised to be decorative and obedient, not independent or resourceful. Jacob set the coffee cup beside her and sat heavily in the other chair. In the morning light, she could see the extent of the scar that ran down the left side of his face, and the way his eyes seemed to carry shadows that had nothing to do with the dawn hour. "Tell me about this, Marcus Thornfield," he said. "What kind of man are we dealing with?" Sarah May wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for both the heat and the distraction. "He's rich, owns more land than anyone else in the territory. Has men working for him who aren't exactly cowboys, if you know what I mean. Politicians in his pocket, including the sheriff in our county. When his first wife died of consumption, everyone whispered about the bruises on her arms. His second wife drowned in a creek that was barely ankle deep." Jacob's expression darkened. He'd known men like Thornfield during his years as a lawman, wealthy, powerful, and utterly without conscience. They operated above the law because they owned the people who were supposed to enforce it. "He's not going to give up," Sarah May continued. "He made it clear that he'd already paid my father for me, like I was a horse at auction. Said I belonged to him now whether I liked it or not." The casual brutality of it made Jacob's hands clench into fists. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the forest as he fought down memories of other innocents he'd failed to protect. After a moment, he reached up and touched something hanging on a peg beside the window, a tarnished military medal. He'd thought he'd hidden well enough that no one would notice it. "You fought in the war," Sarah May observed quietly. Jacob's hand dropped from the medal as if it had burned him. "That was a long time ago." "Which side?" "Union 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry." The words came out flat and emotionless, but Sarah May caught the pain underneath them. "You were an officer." It wasn't a question. Something in his bearing, the way he automatically took charge of situations, spoke of command experience. Jacob turned back to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "Captain," he admitted, "for all the good it did anyone." Sarah May sensed a deep well of pain behind those words, but she didn't push. Instead, she tried to stand, testing her weight on her bandaged feet. They held her, though walking would be slow and painful for a few days. "I should help with breakfast," she said, "to thank you for your kindness." "You don't need to." "I want to." There was quiet determination in her voice. "I'm not used to being helpless, Mr. Hartwell. My family may have treated me like a decoration, but I know how to work." Jacob watched as she moved carefully around his small kitchen, familiarizing herself with his simple setup. She was graceful despite her injuries, efficient in her movements. When she found his meager supply some eggs from the chickens he kept behind the cabin, bacon, flour. For biscuits, she set to work with practiced ease. "Your mother taught you to cook," he observed. "My mother taught me to do whatever would make me a good wife," Sarah May said with a bitter smile. "She just never imagined I'd be using those skills to survive on my own." They worked in companionable silence, Jacob surprised by how natural it felt to have another person in his space. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the complications of human connection. But watching Sarah May move around his kitchen, humming softly as she worked, he remembered what he'd lost when he'd chosen isolation over community. "Why did you become a hermit?" Sarah May asked as they sat down to eat. Jacob nearly choked on his coffee. "Is that what you think I am?" "Aren't you? A man doesn't build a cabin this far from civilization unless he's running from something or hiding from someone." Her directness caught him off guard. Most people danced around personal questions, but Sarah May had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things. Maybe facing death in the wilderness had stripped away her capacity for small talk. "Both, I suppose," he said finally. "I was sheriff in a town called Cedar Falls for 5 years after the war. Thought I could make a difference, help good people live peacefully. Turned out the town council cared more about profits than justice. When I tried to stand up to the corruption, they made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore." It was a simplified version of the truth, leaving out the worst parts, the night raiders who'd burned out homesteaders to make room for cattle barons, the innocent people who died while Jacob fought through legal channels that led nowhere, the final confrontation that had cost him everything he'd thought he was building in Cedar Falls. "So you came here to hide from the world," Sarah May said softly. "To protect the world from me," Jacob corrected. "I'm not a good man, Miss Thornton. The things I've done, the people I've failed, you'd be better off taking your chances in the wilderness than staying here with me." Sarah May studied his face, seeing the self-recrimination and guilt etched in every line. "What happened to make you believe that about yourself?" Jacob stood abruptly, the question hitting too close to wounds that had never properly healed. "We should discuss your plans for leaving. I can give you some supplies, point you toward the safest route to Billings." But Sarah May wasn't ready to let the subject drop. "You saved my life last night. A bad man wouldn't have done that. A good man would have done it without hesitation. I stood in that doorway for a full minute deciding whether or not to help you. But you did help me. That's what matters." Jacob turned away from her earnest gaze, uncomfortable with the absolution he didn't deserve. He'd spent 3 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that isolation was penance for his failures. Having Sarah May chip away at those defenses with her simple faith in human goodness was more terrifying than facing down armed outlaws had ever been. "Marcus Thornfield will come looking for you," he said, changing the subject back to practical matters. "Maybe not today, but soon. You can't outrun him forever." "I know." Sarah May's voice was quiet but steady. "But I'd rather die free than live as his prisoner." The simple courage in her words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Here was a young woman who'd lost everything, who faced impossible odds, and yet she chose defiance over submission. She reminded him of someone else who'd faced overwhelming darkness with quiet bravery, someone he'd failed to save when it mattered most. "One more night," he said suddenly. "Your feet need more time to heal, and it's not safe to travel when you can barely walk. But after that, I'll be gone," Sarah May finished. "I promise I won't bring my troubles to your doorstep any longer than necessary." Jacob nodded, telling himself it was the practical decision. But as he watched Sarah May clean up their breakfast dishes, moving carefully but competently around his kitchen, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. Not in letting her stay, but in planning to let her go. The second day passed more easily than Jacob had expected. Sarah May seemed determined to earn her keep despite his protests, insisting on helping with every task she could manage. She fed his chickens, swept the cabin, mended a tear in one of his shirts, with neat, precise stitches that spoke of years of practice. Her presence brought an unexpected warmth to the space that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. By evening, they'd settled into an easy rhythm of shared conversation that surprised them both. Jacob found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed in Yersh's childhood on a farm in Pennsylvania, his reasons for heading west after the war, even some of the better memories from his time as sheriff. Sarah May listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, that showed she understood the weight behind his carefully chosen words. In return, she told him about her life before the confrontation with her father, the books she'd loved reading in secret, her dreams of seeing the ocean someday. Her younger sister Emma, who still believed their parents would eventually choose love over money. She spoke with the wistful fondness of someone describing a life that now seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. "What will happen to Emma?" Jacob asked, as they sat by the fire after supper. Sarah May's fingers went automatically to the small locket at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she still wore, a simple gold oval that had belonged to her mother. "She's only 14. I pray they'll wait a few years before they try to sell her too. But I'm not certain. My father's debts won't disappear just because I'm gone." Jacob could hear the guilt in her voice, the weight of responsibility for a sister she could no longer protect. It was a burden he understood all too well, the helpless rage that came from being unable to save someone you loved. "You can't fix other people's choices," he said quietly. "I learned that the hard way. But she's my little sister. I should be there to protect her." "And do what? Let Marcus Thornfield destroy you both?" "Sometimes the best protection you can offer someone is to survive whatever's trying to kill you." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, colored by his own guilt over the people he'd failed to save. Sarah May looked at him with those perceptive blue eyes, seeing through his attempt to comfort her to the pain underneath. "Who did you fail to protect?" she asked softly. Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd walked right into that question, opened a door he'd been trying to keep locked for 3 years. But something about the gentle understanding in Sarah May's voice made the walls he'd built around the memory seem thinner than usual. "Her name was Mary," he said finally. "Mary Catherine Wells. She was a schoolteacher in Cedar Falls, 23 years old, and convinced she could civilize the frontier through education and determination." Despite himself, Jacob smiled at the memory. She had red hair and a temper to match, and she wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. Sarah May waited patiently as Jacob stared into the fire, gathering the courage to continue a story he'd never told another living soul. The cattle barons were pushing out the homesteaders, using night riders to burn them out when legal pressure didn't work. Mary organized the farmers, helped them band together for protection. "She came to me for help, said the law was supposed to protect everyone equally, not just the people with money." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. "I tried to work within the system, filed reports, made arrests when I could prove something. But the town council was in the cattle barons' pockets, and every case got dismissed on technicalities. Mary kept pushing, kept believing that justice would prevail if we just followed the right procedures." Jacob's hands clenched into fists as the memories flooded back. "They came for her on a Tuesday night in March, burned down the schoolhouse with her inside it, made it look like an accidental lamp knocked over. Tragic, but not criminal. By the time I got there, there wasn't enough left to prove otherwise." Sarah May's sharp intake of breath drew his attention back to the present. She was looking at him with horror and compassion, her hand pressed to her mouth, as if she could somehow take back the pain his words had caused. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I went after them." Jacob continued, his voice flat and emotionless. "Not as a sheriff, as a man with nothing left to lose, found the night riders 2 days later camped by Willow Creek, all 7 of them." He didn't need to say what had happened next. Sarah May could see it in his eyes, in the way his scarred hands trembled slightly before he clasped them together. "That's when you came here," she said, "to punish yourself for what you'd done, to keep from doing it again. Turns out I'm not as civilized as I thought I was. When push comes to shove, I'm still just a killer with a badge." Sarah May reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and gentle. "You loved her. You were grieving and angry, and there was no justice to be found through legal means. That doesn't make you a bad man, Mr. Hartwell. It makes you human." Jacob stared down at their joined hands, Sarah May's pale fingers covering his weathered knuckles. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with such gentle acceptance, offering comfort instead of judgment. "You should be afraid of me," he said quietly. "Most decent people would be." "Are you going to hurt me?" "No. The answer came without hesitation, surprising him with its certainty. "Then I'm not afraid." Sarah May's smile was soft but determined. "You're a good man who's been carrying too much guilt for too long. Mary wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for loving her." The simple wisdom in her words hit Jacob like a physical blow. For 3 years, he'd been so focused on his failures, his guilt, his self-imposed exile, that he'd forgotten what Mary would actually have wanted for him. She'd believed in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that even broken people could find their way back to the light. "You remind me of her sometimes," he admitted. "Not in looks, but in spirit. The way you refuse to let circumstances break you, the way you see good in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." Sarah May felt her cheeks warm at the comparison. To be likened to someone Jacob had loved, so deeply felt like both an honor and a responsibility she wasn't sure she could live up to. "I don't feel very strong right now," she said honestly. "Most of the time I feel terrified and lost and completely out of my depth." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Jacob said. "It's being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. You've got more backbone than most men I've known." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them and the weight of shared confessions settling into something that felt almost like peace. Sarah May found herself studying Jacob's profile in the firelight, seeing past the scars and the carefully maintained distance to the man underneath, someone who'd lost too much and blamed himself for things beyond his control. "Tomorrow I'll teach you to shoot," Jacob said suddenly. Sarah May blinked in surprise. "I thought you wanted me to leave tomorrow." "I do, but if you're determined to make it on your own out there, you'll need skills to survive. Basic marksmanship, how to read trail signs, where to find water and shelter. Consider it a practical education." "Thank you." The words were inadequate for what she was, feeling gratitude not just for the offer of training, but for the fact that he cared enough about her survival to postpone his desire for solitude. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of winter in the sharp mountain air. Jacob led Sarah May to a clearing behind his cabin where he'd set up makeshift target tin cans, balanced on fallen logs at varying distances. He handed her his spare revolver, a well-maintained Colt that felt heavy and foreign in her hands. "First lesson," Jacob said, moving behind her to adjust her stance. "Respect the weapon. It's not a tool for intimidation or empty threats. If you draw a gun, be prepared to use it. If you use it, shoot to stop the threat permanently." His hands guided hers, showing her how to properly grip the weapon, how to align the sights, how to breathe and squeeze, rather than jerk the trigger. Sarah May tried to focus on his instructions, but found herself distracted by his proximity, the warmth of his body behind her, the steady confidence in his voice, the way his hands covered hers with gentle authority. "Try not to think too much," Jacob said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "Trust your instincts and let the shot come naturally." Sarah May took a deep breath, lined up her sights on the nearest tin can, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands with surprising force, and her shot went wide, kicking up dirt several feet to the left of her target. "Good first attempt," Jacob said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "But you're overthinking it. Try again." For the next hour, Jacob patiently coached her through the basics of marksmanship. Sarah May proved to be a quick learner, her natural coordination and determination overcoming her initial nervousness. By the time they finished, she'd managed to hit 3 of the 6 targets, not expert shooting, but competent enough to potentially save her life if the need arose. "Not bad for a beginner," Jacob said as they walked back toward the cabin. "With practice, you could become quite good at this." Sarah May tucked the gun into the holster Jacob had given her, still not entirely comfortable with the weight of it at her hip. "I hope I never have to use it." "So do I. But hoping isn't the same as being prepared." They spent the rest of the morning going over basic survival skill show to read the weather, how to find direction without a compass, how to identify edible plants and clean water sources. Jacob was a patient teacher, breaking down complex skills into manageable lessons that Sarah May could absorb and remember. But as the day wore on, both of them became increasingly aware that their time together was drawing to a close. Tomorrow, Sarah May would have to leave the safety of Jacob's cabin and venture back into a world where Marcus Thornfield's money and influence made him nearly untouchable. The thought hung between them like a storm cloud, darkening their interactions with unspoken worry. That evening, as they prepared supper together, Sarah May found herself memorizing details the way Jacob moved with unconscious grace despite his size. The rare moments when his guard dropped, and she caught glimpses of the gentler man beneath the protective armor. The sound of his quiet laughter when she told him stories about her sister's childhood mischief. "I have something for you," Jacob said as they finished eating. He disappeared into the cabin's small loft and returned with something wrapped in soft cloth. When Sarah May unwrapped it, she gasped in surprise. It was a small wooden bird, carved with exquisite detail from what looked like cherry wood. Every feather was perfectly rendered, and the bird's wings were spread as if caught in mid-flight. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth curves. "Did you make this?" Jacob nodded, looking almost embarrassed. "Used to be a hobby of mine before. I found that piece of wood a few months ago and couldn't stop thinking about carving it. Seemed like it wanted to be a bird." Sarah May looked up at him with wonder. This rough, battle-scarred man had created something so delicate and beautiful that it took her breath away. It spoke of hidden depths, of artistic sensitivity that survived beneath layers of pain and self-protection. "Why are you giving this to me?" "So you'll remember that even in the darkest times, there's still beauty in the world. And so you'll know that someone believes you deserve good things." The simple gift and the words that came with it nearly undid her completely. Sarah May felt tears prick her eyes as she clutched the wooden bird to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness of this man who claimed to be dangerous and unworthy of trust. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." As they sat by the fire that night, Sarah May tucked safely in Jacob's spare blanket and the wooden bird cradled in her hands. Both of them tried not to think about tomorrow's goodbye. Neither wanted to acknowledge the connection that had grown between them, the way two broken souls had found unexpected comfort in each other's company. But in the distance, neither of them heard the sound of horses moving through the forest, or saw the glint of firelight reflecting off spyglass lenses as men with hard faces and cruel intentions finally located the cabin they'd been searching for. Jacob woke before dawn with the instincts of a man who'd spent too many years sleeping with one ear open for trouble. Something had disturbed his sleep. Not a sound, exactly, but the absence of familiar night sounds. The forest was too quiet, as if the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures had been frightened into silence by something that didn't belong. He lay still for a moment, listening intently while his eyes adjusted to the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah May slept peacefully in the chair by the banked fire, the wooden bird still clutched in her hands. 3 days had passed since she'd first knocked on his door, and what was supposed to have been one night of shelter had become something neither of them wanted to end. Moving silently, Jacob slipped from his bedroll and padded to the window. The forest beyond appeared normal tall pines, swaying gently in the morning breeze, patches of early snow gleaming in the starlight. But his instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile territory, insisted that something was wrong. A twig snapped somewhere to the east of the cabin, too sharp and deliberate to be made by any forest animal. Jacob's blood ran cold as he recognized the sound for what it was, the careless step of a man trying to move quietly through unfamiliar terrain. They'd been found. Jacob moved swiftly but silently, gathering his rifle and checking the loads in both his revolvers. He shook Sarah May gently awake, pressing his hand over her mouth before she could speak. "We have company," he whispered against her ear. "Get dressed quickly and quietly. We need to be ready to move." Sarah May's eyes went wide with understanding and fear, but she nodded and began pulling on her boots with hands that trembled only slightly. Jacob had to admire her composure, Many people would have panicked at the news that their worst fears had caught up with them. Moving to different windows, Jacob counted at least 4 distinct positions around the cabin where men were trying to remain hidden. Professional work, probably hired guns rather than ordinary ranch hands. Marcus Thornfield had spared no expense in tracking down his runaway bride. "How many?" Sarah May whispered as she joined him at the window. "Too many for a direct fight," Jacob replied grimly, "but this cabin has some advantages they don't know about." He led her to what appeared to be a solid wall near the back of the cabin. But when he pressed a hidden catch, a section of the logs swung inward to reveal a narrow passage. Root cellar connects to a tunnel that comes out in the pine grove 50 yards north. Built it as an escape route when I first settled here. Sarah May stared at the hidden passage in amazement. "You really were expecting trouble." "A man learns to plan for the worst when he's made the kind of enemies I have." Jacob handed her his spare revolver and a bag of supplies he'd prepared for just such an emergency. "Follow the tunnel to the end. There's a cache of food and blankets hidden under the big fallen log where it exits. Wait for me there." "What about you?" Jacob's smile was cold and dangerous, reminding Sarah May that beneath his gentle treatment of her lay a man capable of terrible violence when necessary. "I'm going to convince these gentlemen that tracking people to my home was a serious mistake." "Jacob, no. There are too many of them. Just come with me now. If we both run, they'll follow us, and eventually they'll catch us, because Thornfield has more resources than we do. But if I make this too costly for them, maybe they'll decide you're not worth the price." Sarah May grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the wool of his shirt. "I won't let you die for me. I won't be responsible for another good person getting killed because of my troubles." The pain in her voice stopped Jacob cold. He turned to face her fully, seeing not just fear for his safety, but a deeper anguish, the weight of guilt she carried for every person who might suffer because of her refusal to submit to Marcus Thornfield's demands. "This isn't your fault," he said firmly, "and I'm not planning to die today, but I need to know you're safe before I can focus on dealing with our visitors." Before Sarah May could protest further, the silence outside was broken by a voice calling from the tree line. "Jacob Hartwell, we know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to Mr. Thornfield. Send the girl out, and nobody has to get hurt." Jacob's expression darkened at the casual assumption that Sarah May was property to be returned. "Like hell," he muttered. He moved to the window and called back. "Sarah May Thornton is a free citizen under territorial law. She's not property, and she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Harsh laughter echoed from the forest. "Law doesn't mean much out here, Hartwell. Mr. Thornfield has legal papers saying the girl belongs to him. You're harboring stolen property, which makes you a criminal." "Then come and take her," Jacob replied, his voice carrying the deadly promise of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. Sarah May felt her blood turn to ice. Legal papers. Marcus had actually managed to create some kind of documentation that gave him a claim on her. Even if they escaped today, those papers would follow them wherever they went, making her a fugitive and Jacob an accessory to theft. "Go," Jacob said urgently, guiding her toward the hidden passage. "Whatever legal tricks Thornfield has pulled, we'll figure out how to fight them later. Right now, we just need to survive." Sarah May wanted to argue, wanted to refuse to leave him facing impossible odds alone. But the sound of men moving closer to the cabin convinced her that staying would only make his job harder. She squeezed his hand once, hard enough to bruise, then slipped into the dark passage. The tunnel was narrow and rough, clearly hand-dug over many long hours. Sarah May crawled through the darkness, guided by the faint current of fresh air that told her she was heading in the right direction. Behind her, she could hear voices growing louder as the men surrounding the cabin grew bolder. She emerged from the tunnel into the pre-dawn grey, finding herself in a dense grove of pines, exactly where Jacob had said she would be. The hidden cache was there as promised, a waterproof sack containing food, blankets, and ammunition. Sarah May pulled out one of the blankets and wrapped it around her shoulders, then settled down to wait and worry. The first gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder, followed immediately by a string of curses and the sound of men scrambling for better cover. Jacob had fired first, which meant he'd identified a threat worth engaging. Sarah May gripped the wooden bird he'd carved for her, using it as an anchor to keep from running back toward the cabin. More shots followed in rapid succession, the sharp crack of rifle fire mixed with the deeper boom of Jacob's heavy revolvers. The men surrounding the cabin had clearly underestimated their target, expecting an easy capture rather than a fight against someone with military training and intimate knowledge of the terrain. "He's in the loft," someone shouted. "Briggs, circle around back and flush him out." Sarah May heard the sound of running feet and held her breath, knowing that any man who circled the cabin might discover the tunnel entrance. But Jacob had planned for that too. Moments later, a tremendous crash echoed through the forest as one of his carefully placed traps caught an unwary pursuer. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Jacob had the advantages of cover and preparation, but his attackers had numbers and the promise of Marcus Thornfield's money to motivate them. Sarah May found herself praying to a god she'd questioned since her family's betrayal, begging for Jacob's safety with an intensity that surprised her. Finally, an eerie silence settled over the forest. Sarah May strained her ears, listening for any sound that might tell her how the fight had ended. When she heard footsteps approaching through the trees, she drew the revolver Jacob had given her, determined to sell her life dearly if his attackers had won. But it was Jacob who emerged from the pine grove, moving with the careful gait of a man who'd been hurt but was still functional. Blood stained his shirt sleeve, and his face was grim with the aftermath of violence, but he was alive and walking under his own power. "How bad are you hurt?" Sarah May asked as she rushed to his side. "Bullet grazed my arm, nothing serious. But we need to move. I discouraged them, but I didn't kill them all. They'll regroup and come back with reinforcements." Sarah May helped him bind his wounded arm with strips torn from her petticoat, her hands steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "What did they mean about legal papers?" Jacob's expression grew even grimmer. "Marriage contracts can be legally binding in some territories, especially if they involve financial settlements. If your father signed papers accepting payment for your hand, Thornfield might have grounds to claim breach of contract. But that's slavery. You can't sell a person like livestock. You can if the law looks the other way and you have enough money to buy the right judges." Jacob shouldered the pack of supplies and checked his weapons. "We'll figure out how to fight it legally later. Right now, we need distance and time to think." As they prepared to leave the only home Jacob had known for 3 years, Sarah May felt the weight of guilt settle heavily on her shoulders. Because of her, he'd lost his sanctuary and been forced back into the violence he'd tried to leave behind. Because of her, they were both fugitives now, running from a man with resources they couldn't match. But as they set off through the forest together, Jacob's wounded arm in a makeshift sling and his eyes constantly scanning for threats, Sarah May realized something else. For the first time since being thrown out of her family home, she didn't feel alone. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together. And somehow, that made even the worst possibilities seem bearable. They traveled through the wilderness for 2 days, keeping to deer trails and creek beds that would make them harder to track. Jacob's knowledge of the territory proved invaluably, knew every hidden valley and forgotten mining camp, every water source and natural shelter. But even with his expertise, the constant vigilance and rough travel wore on them both. On the second evening, they took shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin that Jacob remembered from his early days in the territory. It was little more than 4 walls and a leaking roof, but it offered protection from the wind and a place to build a small hidden fire. As Sarah May tended to Jacob's wound, which was healing cleanly despite their rough conditions, she noticed him staring at something he'd pulled from his coat pocket. It was a faded photograph, the edges worn soft from handling. Even in the dim firelight, Sarah May could make out the image of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a tall man in a sheriff's badge who looked like a younger, happier version of Jacob. "That's her," Sarah May said softly. "Mary." Jacob nodded, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph with unconscious tenderness. "Took this picture on our wedding day. We'd been married exactly 3 weeks when she died." The pain in his voice was as fresh as if the loss had happened yesterday instead of 3 years ago. Sarah May felt her heart break a little for this man who carried his grief like a wound that wouldn't heal. "She was beautiful," Sarah May said. "You can see the intelligence in her eyes, the strength." "She would have liked you," Jacob said, carefully tucking the photograph back into his pocket. "Mary always believed that people were fundamentally good, that given the chance, they'd choose what was right over what was easy. I used to think she was naive, but watching you these past few days, maybe she understood something I didn't." Sarah May felt heat rise in her cheeks at the comparison. To be thought worthy of approval from someone Jacob had loved so deeply felt like receiving a benediction from a saint. "I'm not nearly as good as you think I am," she said quietly. "I've brought nothing but trouble into your life. Because of me, you've lost your home, been wounded, forced back into the very violence you came to the mountains to escape." Jacob set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Sarah May, listen to me carefully. What happened to us isn't your fault. You didn't choose to have a greedy father or a predatory suitor. You didn't ask for any of this. All you did was refuse to let other people decide your fate for you. But you were safe before I came. You had peace." "I had isolation," Jacob corrected. "There's a difference. Peace comes from being at harmony with yourself and your place in the world. What I had was just an empty kind of quiet that let me pretend my problems had gone away." He reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against her skin. "These past few days, fighting beside you, protecting something that matters, reminded me who I used to be before the guilt and anger consumed everything else. You haven't ruined my life, Sarah May. You've helped me remember what it felt like to have one." The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. She looked into his eyes and saw something that made her pulse quicken. Not just kindness or protectiveness, but something deeper and more dangerous. Something that looked very much like the beginning of love. "Jacob," she whispered, uncertain what she was asking for. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too, and I know it's wrong and dangerous and probably the worst possible timing. But—" Sarah May silenced him by rising from her seat and crossing the small space between them. She cupped his scarred face in her hands and kissed him with all the desperate tenderness of a woman who'd found something precious in the midst of losing everything else. Jacob froze for a heartbeat, then wrapped his arms around her and kissed her back with a hunger that spoke of 3 years of loneliness and the sudden, overwhelming realization that he didn't want to be alone anymore. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and staring at each other with wonder and uncertainty. "This complicates things," Jacob said, though he made no move to let her go. "Everything was already complicated," Sarah May replied. "At least now we have something worth fighting for besides just survival." Jacob rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as he struggled with the implications of what had just happened between them. He'd sworn never to care about anyone again, never to give fate another hostage to use against him. But Sarah May had slipped past his defenses so quietly and completely that by the time he realized what was happening, it was far too late to protect himself. "If we do this," he said quietly, "if we let this become what I think it's becoming, there's no going back. I won't be able to walk away from you, and that means I'll fight any threat to you until one of us is dead. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment from a man you've known less than a week?" Sarah May thought about her answer carefully. Everything in her life had taught her to be cautious, to weigh decisions carefully and consider all possible consequences. But sitting here in this abandoned cabin with this gentle, broken man who'd risked everything to protect her, caution felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. "I've never felt safer with anyone than I do with you," she said. And I've never felt more myself than I have these past few days. If that's not love, it's close enough to build a life on." Jacob's smile was the first, truly happy expression she'd seen from him, transforming his scarred face into something beautiful. "Then I guess we're committed to seeing this through together." They spent that night holding each other by the dying fire, talking quietly about possibilities and futures that seemed impossibly distant given their current circumstances. Jacob told her about the land he'd seen further north, isolated valleys where a man and woman could build a homestead and live peacefully if they weren't too particular about amenities. Sarah May spoke of her dreams of having a real home again, a place where she could plant a garden and maybe keep chickens and build something lasting with someone who valued her for more than her potential bride price. But their peace was shattered the next morning when they woke to the sound of horses approaching through the forest. Many horses moving with the organized precision of a well-funded search party. Jacob was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, and scanning the tree line for threats. Through gaps in the cabin's chinking, they could see at least a dozen riders spreading out to surround their position. At the head of the group rode a man Sarah May recognized with sick dread, Marcus Thornfield himself, his pale eyes scanning the cabin like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Sarah May," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you're in there, girl. You've led me quite a chase, but it's time to stop this foolishness and come home where you belong." "I don't belong to you," Sarah May called back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "According to the territorial judge, you do. I have the legal papers right here, a binding marriage contract signed by your father and witnessed by 3 upstanding citizens. You're my lawful wife, whether you went through a ceremony or not, and that makes you my property under territorial law." Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. "The territory doesn't recognize forced marriage, Thornfield, and it sure as hell doesn't recognize slavery." "Ah, the famous Jacob Hartwell. I wondered who was helping my runaway bride make such trouble for me." Marcus's voice took on a mocking tone. "You know, I remember you from your sheriff days. Heard you had some trouble in Cedar Falls, something about losing your temper and killing folks who didn't deserve it. Seems you haven't learned to mind your own business." The casual cruelty of bringing up Mary's death and the aftermath that had destroyed Jacob's life made Sarah May see red. Before Jacob could stop her, she stepped into view at the cabin's single window. "You want me, Marcus? Then let's discuss terms. Just you and me, face to face, no weapons. If you can convince me that marriage to you is preferable to whatever alternative I'm facing, I'll come with you willingly." Jacob stared at her in horror. "Sarah May, no, you can't trust him." "But I can trust myself," she replied quietly. "And I need to hear what he's really offering, what these legal papers actually say. Maybe there's a way out of this that doesn't involve a bloodbath." Marcus considered her proposal, clearly intrigued by the opportunity to demonstrate his power over her without the messy complications of a gunfight. "Very well. You have 5 minutes to convince me you're worth more trouble than you've already caused." As Sarah May prepared to step outside and face the man who claimed to own her, Jacob made a decision that would change everything. He might not be able to protect her from the legal complexities of territorial law, but he could make sure she knew exactly where she stood with at least one person in this God-forsaken situation. "Sarah May," he said quietly, catching her hand as she moved toward the door. "Whatever happens out there, whatever he says or threatens or promises, you need to know something. I love you, completely and without reservation, and I'll spend the rest of my life fighting for your freedom if that's what it takes." The words hit her like a physical blow, filling her with strength and courage she didn't know she possessed. Whatever Marcus Thornfield had to say, whatever legal machinations he'd arranged, she now knew with absolute certainty that she had something worth fighting for. Someone who saw her as a person rather than property, who valued her choices and respected her strength. Armed with that knowledge, Sarah May Thornton stepped out to face her would-be captor, ready to fight for her freedom with every weapon at her disposal. Marcus Thornfield sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced a challenge he couldn't buy his way out of. Up close, Sarah May could see the cruelty that lurked behind his pale blue eyes, the way his soft hands rested on his saddle horn with the confidence of someone who'd never had to fight his own battles. He was exactly what she'd expected a predator dressed in gentleman's clothing. "You look well, my dear," Marcus said, his gaze traveling over her torn dress and wind-tangled hair with obvious satisfaction. A bit rough around the edges, but nothing that can't be corrected with proper guidance. "I'm not your dear, and I never will be," Sarah May replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a living thing. Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, holding it up so she could see the official territorial seal. "This says otherwise. A binding marriage contract, properly witnessed and legally filed. Your father was quite reasonable once we discussed the full extent of his debts." Sarah May's blood ran cold. "What debts?" "Oh, my dear girl, you really have been kept in the dark, haven't you?" Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade. "Your father didn't just owe money for his gambling losses. He'd been borrowing against your family's land for years, using forged documents to secure loans he had no ability to repay. When the banks came calling, he faced a choice prison for fraud or finding another way to settle his obligations." The words hit Sarah May like physical blows. Her father wasn't just greedy or weak, he was a criminal who'd been stealing from his own family for years. And she was the currency he'd used to buy his way out of the consequences. "Even if that's true, you can't force someone into marriage," Sarah May said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Marcus laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. "Can't I? The contract is quite specific. In exchange for assuming all of your father's debts and legal liabilities, I receive the hand of his eldest daughter in marriage. Failure to honor the contract results in immediate foreclosure on all family properties and prosecution for fraud. Your little sister would be left destitute, and your parents would spend the rest of their lives in territorial prison." The trap was even more complete than Sarah May had imagined. By refusing to marry Marcus, she wasn't just saving herself, she was condemning her entire family to ruin and disgrace. The weight of that knowledge settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. "You see," Marcus continued, reading the despair in her expression with obvious pleasure, "this isn't about what you want, my dear, it's about what you owe. Your family has taken my money under false pretenses, and now that debt must be repaid, I'm simply choosing to be paid in flesh rather than demanding blood." From inside the cabin, Jacob had been listening to every word with growing rage. He'd seen contracts like this before, carefully crafted legal documents that used technicalities and loopholes to circumvent territorial laws against forced marriage. In the right court, with the right judge, such a contract might actually be enforceable. But there was something about Thornfield's explanation that didn't sit right. The man was too confident, too willing to reveal details that should have been kept private. In Jacob's experience, predators who gloated about their schemes usually had something to hide. "Show me the contract," Sarah May demanded, surprising both Marcus and herself with her boldness. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon. If this document is as legally binding as you claim, you shouldn't have any problem letting me read it. I want to see exactly what my father signed." For just a moment, Marcus hesitated. It was barely a pause, but Sarah May caught it a flicker of uncertainty that suggested he wasn't quite as confident in his legal position as he pretended to be. "The specific terms are really quite technical," Marcus said smoothly. "I hardly think—" "I can read," Sarah May interrupted, "and I want to see what you claim gives you the right to own another human being." Marcus's facade of genteel civility slipped slightly, revealing the violence that lurked beneath his polished exterior. "You forget yourself, girl. Wives are property under territorial law, just like livestock or land. The only question is whether you'll come willingly or whether I'll have to drag you back in chains. Let her see the contract, Thornfield." Jacob's voice carried clearly across the clearing as he emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand but not immediately threatening. His scarred face was set in lines of cold fury that made several of Marcus's men shift nervously in their saddles. "This doesn't concern you, Hartwell," Marcus said, though his own hand moved toward the gun at his hip. "Anything that concerns Sarah May concerns me," Jacob replied, "and I'm curious to see these legal papers that supposedly give you the right to commit kidnapping in broad daylight." Marcus looked between them, clearly realizing that their relationship had deepened beyond simple protector and refugee. His pale eyes glittered with malicious amusement as he calculated how to use this new information to his advantage. "Ah, I see. The lonely hermit has found himself a woman and thinks he can play knight-errant." Marcus's voice dripped with contempt. "Tell me, Hartwell, what exactly are you offering her? A life hiding in the wilderness, always looking over your shoulder, never knowing when the law will catch up with your past crimes. At least I can give her comfort and security." "You can give her slavery and abuse," Jacob replied flatly, "same as you gave your last 2 wives before you killed them." The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Several of Marcus's men looked uncomfortable at the reminder of their employer's violent reputation, while Marcus himself went very still in his saddle. "Those are serious accusations, Hartwell. I hope you can prove them." "I don't have to prove anything, but I notice you're not denying them either." Sarah May watched this deadly verbal sparring with growing understanding. Jacob was doing more than just defending her. He was probing for weaknesses, looking for some flaw in Marcus's position that could be exploited. And Marcus, for all his bluster about legal documents and binding contracts, seemed awfully reluctant to actually show those papers to anyone. "The contract," Sarah May said again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Show it to me now, or admit that you're nothing but a kidnapper hiding behind forged documents." The challenge was deliberately provocative, designed to force Marcus into a corner where he had to either produce the evidence of his claims or reveal that they were built on lies. For a long moment, the clearing was silent except for the restless movement of horses and the whisper of wind through the pines. Finally, Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew the folded document, but instead of handing it to Sarah May, he held it up just far enough for her to see the official seals and signatures. "Satisfied?" he asked. Sarah May moved closer, squinting to make out the details of the document in the morning light. What she saw made her blood run cold, but not for the reasons Marcus expected. The contract was real enough. Official seals, proper signatures, legal language that bound her father to terms that would indeed result in her marriage to Marcus Thornfield. But as she read the specific clauses, Sarah May noticed something that made her heart race with sudden hope. "This contract names Sarah May Thornton as the bride," she said slowly, pointing to the relevant line. "Of course it does," Marcus replied impatiently. "You are Sarah May Thornton." "Actually," Sarah May said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I'm not. Not anymore." Marcus frowned, clearly not understanding what she was driving at. But Jacob, watching from his position near the cabin, suddenly understood what Sarah May had realized. His scarred face broke into the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. "Explain yourself," Marcus demanded, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. Sarah May looked directly at Jacob, her blue eyes shining with love and defiance. "Jacob Hartwell, will you marry me?" "Yes," Jacob replied without hesitation, understanding immediately what she was offering. "Right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses." Marcus went pale as he grasped the implications. "You can't. That's not legal." "Common law marriage is recognized throughout the territory," Jacob said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent years enforcing territorial statutes. "All it requires is mutual consent, declared in front of witnesses, and the intent to live as husband and wife." "I, Sarah May Thornton, take you, Jacob Hartwell, as my lawful husband," Sarah May declared clearly, her voice carrying across the clearing to every man present. "And I, Jacob Hartwell, take you, Sarah May, as my lawful wife," Jacob responded, stepping forward to take her hands in his. The simple ceremony took less than a minute, but its legal implications were staggering. As Sarah May Hartwell, she was no longer bound by any contract that named Sarah May Thornton as the bride. The marriage transferred any legal obligations from her father's household to her husband's protection, effectively nullifying Marcus's claims. "You scheming little," Marcus began, his face flushing with rage. "Careful," Jacob warned, his hand moving to his gun. "You're talking about my wife now." Marcus looked around at his men, clearly calculating whether he had enough firepower to simply take what he wanted, regardless of legal niceties. But several of his hired guns were looking uncomfortable with the situation. Kidnapping a runaway bride was one thing, but attacking a lawfully married couple was another matter entirely. "This isn't over," Marcus snarled. "I've invested too much in this arrangement to let some wilderness hermit steal what belongs to me." "Nothing belongs to you," Sarah May replied firmly, "and nothing ever did. I was never yours to claim, no matter what papers you waved around or what debts my father owed." Marcus wheeled his horse around, clearly furious but uncertain how to proceed. The legal foundation of his claim had just crumbled beneath him, and violence in front of so many witnesses would raise questions he couldn't afford to answer. "Enjoy your brief happiness," he called back as he spurred his horse toward the tree line. "But remember, I own half the judges in this territory, and I have a long memory for those who cross me. This marriage won't protect you forever." As Marcus and his men disappeared into the forest, Sarah May sagged against Jacob's chest, overwhelmed by the emotional whiplash of the past hour. They'd found a way out of the immediate trap, but Marcus's parting words carried the ring of truth. A man with his resources and connections wouldn't simply give up because of a legal technicality. "Are we really married?" Sarah May asked softly. Jacob wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the magnitude of what they'd just done settled over them both. "As married as anyone can be without a preacher and a church. The question is whether you're having second thoughts about binding yourself to a broken-down ex-sheriff with more enemies than sense." Sarah May looked up at him, seeing past the scars and the guilt to the good man beneath. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather face an uncertain future with. But Jacob, what about Emma? My family? If Marcus can't have me, he might take his anger out on them." Jacob's expression grew thoughtful. "We need to get to town. Find out exactly what legal documents Marcus actually filed and what your family's real situation is. If your father was involved in fraud, there might be ways to help that don't involve sacrificing you to a predator. And if there aren't?" Jacob's smile was grim but determined. "Then we'll find another way. I didn't get you away from one bad situation just to abandon your family to another one." As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave the abandoned cabin, Sarah May felt a complex mixture of emotions. Fear for what Marcus might do next, worry for her family's safety, but underlying it all, a growing sense of hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't facing it alone. The wooden bird Jacob had carved for her rested safely in her pocket, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances there could still be beauty and kindness. And now she wore his name as well as his gift, bound to him by laws that even Marcus Thornfield would have trouble breaking. But as they set off through the forest toward an uncertain future, neither of them noticed the lone rider who'd separated from Marcus's group and now followed at a discreet distance, his orders clear and his intentions deadly. Marcus Thornfield might have lost this particular battle, but the war was far from over. The town of Cedar Creek sat in a valley between two ranges of hills, a collection of weathered buildings that had grown up around a trading post and never quite managed to become anything more prosperous. Jacob and Sarah May approached it cautiously, knowing that Marcus Thornfield's influence extended far beyond his own ranch. Every sheriff, every judge, every merchant who depended on his business was potentially an enemy. They'd spent 3 days traveling through back trails and forgotten paths, moving carefully and watching for signs of pursuit. Jacob's knowledge of the territory served them well, but they both knew they couldn't hide in the wilderness forever. If they were going to build any kind of life together, they needed to understand exactly what legal complications they faced. Jacob led them to the cabin of an old friender, grizzled former mountain man named Pete Kowalski, who ran a small trading post on the outskirts of town. Pete had fought alongside Jacob during the war and was one of the few people in the territory who didn't fear Marcus Thornfield's retribution. "Jacob Hartwell, you old buzzard," Pete called out as they approached his cabin. "Heard you'd become a hermit up in the high country. What brings you back to civilization?" Jacob dismounted and helped Sarah May down from their borrowed horse, acquired from an abandoned line shack they'd discovered during their journey. "Trouble, Pete. The kind that follows a man whether he wants it or not." Pete's weathered face grew serious as he studied Sarah May's face and the way Jacob positioned himself protectively beside her. "This wouldn't have anything to do with Marcus Thornfield's missing bride, would it? Word is he's offering $1,000 for information leading to her recovery." $1,000, Sarah May breathed. That was more money than most people in the territory saw in 5 years. No wonder Marcus was confident he'd find her eventually with that kind of reward posted. Every drifter and desperate man for hundreds of miles would be looking for her. "She's not missing," Jacob said firmly. "She's my wife, legally married and under my protection. But we need to understand what kind of legal trap Thornfield thinks he's set." Pete ushered them inside his cabin, which was cluttered with trade goods and the accumulated possessions of 40 years on the frontier. He poured coffee and listened carefully as Jacob and Sarah May explained the situation, the forced engagement, Sarah May's flight, the marriage contract, and their desperate solution. "Smart thinking with the common law marriage," Pete said when they finished. "But Thornfield's not the kind of man who accepts legal defeats gracefully. He'll find another angle to attack from." "What do you know about my family's situation?" Sarah May asked. "Marcus claimed my father had been borrowing money illegally, using forged documents." Pete's expression grew uncomfortable. "Might be some truth to that, girl. Your father's been drinking heavy and gambling heavier for the past couple years. Word around town is that he owes money to some very unforgiving people." Sarah May felt her heart sink. If her father really was guilty of fraud, Marcus's contract might be the only thing standing between her family and complete ruin. Her marriage to Jacob had solved her immediate problem, but potentially created a larger one. "There's something else you need to know," Pete continued reluctantly. "Thornfield's hired himself some new help. Professional gunmen from back east, the kind who don't ask questions as long as the money's good. He's not planning to rely on legal maneuvering this time." Jacob's expression hardened. He'd seen hired killers before and knew what their presence meant. Marcus had decided that if he couldn't have Sarah May through legal means, he'd simply eliminate the obstacles in his way. "How many men?" Jacob asked. "At least 6 that I've seen, maybe more. They're staying at the hotel, keeping quiet but asking a lot of questions about you and your background. Professional work, they're not just planning to kill you, they're studying you first." The knowledge that trained killers were actively hunting him brought back memories Jacob had tried to bury. During his law enforcement days, he'd faced similar threats and learned that the only way to deal with professional predators was to strike first and strike hard. But that had been when he was alone, when he had only his own life to consider. "We need to leave," Sarah May said quietly, reading the calculation in Jacob's eyes. "Find somewhere else to start over, far from here." "Running won't solve this," Jacob replied. "Thornfield has the resources to track us anywhere in the territory, and now he's motivated by revenge as much as desire. He won't stop until one of us is dead." "Then what do you suggest?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities and strategies. In his hidden cache of supplies, back at the abandoned cabin, he'd left something he'd hoped never to use again, a collection of weapons and equipment from his war days. Tools of violence that he'd kept as reminders of what he'd once been capable of. "Pete," he said finally, "I need you to ride back to the trapper's cabin where we've been staying. There's a cache hidden under the floorboards, in the back room, military surplus mostly. Bring it all here." Pete's eyebrows rose. "You're planning to fight them?" "I'm planning to end this before it destroys everything we're trying to build." Jacob turned to Sarah May, his expression grave. "But you need to understand what that means. If I go after Thornfield and his hired guns, I'll be the same man I was in Cedar Falls there. one who solved problems with violence instead of law. Are you prepared to be married to a killer? Sarah May looked into his eyes, seeing the pain the question caused him. This was the choice he'd been avoiding for 3 years, whether to remain the peaceful hermit he'd tried to become or to embrace the dangerous man he'd always been underneath. I'm prepared to be married to a man who protects the people he loves, she said firmly. What you were in the past doesn't define what you have to be in the future. But if violence is the only language Marcus Thornfield understands, then maybe it's time someone spoke to him in terms he can't ignore. Jacob felt something shift inside his chest knot, the cold rage that had driven him in Cedar Falls, but something warmer and more focused. For the first time since Mary's death, he had something worth fighting for that was still alive, still within his power to protect. It won't be easy, he warned. Thornfield's men are professionals, and they'll be expecting trouble. This isn't going to be a fair fight or a civilized confrontation. It's going to be war. Then we'd better make sure we win, Sarah May replied. Pete left immediately to retrieve Jacob's cash, riding hard through the gathering dusk. While they waited for his return, Jacob and Sarah May planned their strategy. The professionals Thornfield had hired would expect Jacob to either run or defend himself reactively. What they wouldn't expect was a preemptive strike designed to eliminate the threat permanently. There's something I need to tell you, Sarah May said as they sat by Pete's fire, cleaning and checking the weapons Jacob carried. When I was reading Marcus's contract, I noticed something strange. The debt amounts didn't match what I knew about my father's gambling losses. They were much larger, and they were structured in a way that seemed designed to be impossible to repay. Jacob looked up from the rifle he was examining. What are you saying? I think Marcus orchestrated my father's financial problems, the gambling debts, the forged documents. What if Marcus arranged all of it as a way to acquire me legally? He's been planning this for months, maybe years. The implications were staggering. If Sarah May was right, then Marcus's pursuit of her wasn't just about desire or wounded pride, was about a carefully constructed scheme that had cost him significant time and money. That made him even more dangerous, because men who invested that much in a plan didn't abandon it easily. If you're right, Jacob said slowly, then your family might not be guilty of anything except trusting the wrong man. But it also means Thornfield won't give up until he either gets what he wants or destroys anyone who stands in his way. All the more reason to end this quickly, Sarah May replied, before he can hurt anyone else. When Pete returned with Jacob's cash, Sarah May got her first look at the tools of her husband's former trade. Military-grade weapons, specialized equipment, maps marked with tactical notations, the accumulated arsenal of a man who'd been very good at a very dangerous job. Sweet Mary and Joseph, Pete whispered as Jacob unpacked the cash. I knew you were military, but I didn't realize you were special forces. Special reconnaissance, Jacob corrected. We went places other units couldn't go, and did things other units couldn't do. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's something I'm good at. Sarah May watched her husband transform before her eyes. The gentle, guilt-ridden hermit was being replaced by something harder and more focused Cedar, professional warrior preparing for battle. It should have frightened her, but instead she felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. This was the man she'd married, all of him, and she wouldn't let him face his demons alone. What do you need me to do? She asked. Jacob looked at her in surprise. Nothing. You're going to stay here with Pete where it's safe. Like hell I am. Sarah May's voice carried the same steel that had enabled her to defy her family and survive alone in the wilderness. This is my fight as much as yours, and I'm not hiding while you risk your life for my freedom. Sarah May. No arguments, Jacob. We're partners now, in everything. If you're going to war, then we're going to war together. Jacob studied his wife's determined face and realized that arguing would be pointless. Sarah May had already proven that she was stronger and more capable than her sheltered upbringing suggested. And truthfully, having her with him would allow him to protect her more effectively than leaving her behind and worrying about her safety. All right, he said finally, But we do this my way, and you follow my lead without question. Professional killers don't give second chances to people who make mistakes. As they prepared for what would likely be the final confrontation with Marcus Thornfield and his hired guns, both Jacob and Sarah May understood that they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. But sometimes, when faced with evil that wouldn't respond to reason or mercy, the only choice was to meet violence with greater violence. Tomorrow, they would discover whether love and determination could triumph over money and professional brutality. Tonight, they held each other close and tried not to think about all the ways their plan could go wrong. Dawn broke grey and cold over Cedar Creek, with the promise of snow in the heavy clouds that hung over the valley. Jacob and Sarah May had been in position since before first light, watching the hotel where Marcus Thornfield's hired killers were staying. The building was a two-story structure with a covered porch and multiple exits, not ideal for a siege, but defensible enough that the professionals inside would feel confident in their position. Jacob had spent the night studying the building's layout and the patterns of movement around it. The hired guns were good. They posted sentries, varied their routines, and never presented easy targets. But they were also overconfident, secure in their reputation and their employer's money. That overconfidence would be their weakness. "Remember," Jacob whispered to Sarah May as they crouched behind a pile of lumber near the town's general store, "when this starts, it's going to happen fast. Stay low, stay behind cover, and don't try to be a hero. Your job is to watch for anyone trying to flank us and to make sure Marcus doesn't escape." Sarah May nodded, checking the load in the revolver Jacob had given her. Her hands were steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a living thing. Everything they'd built together over the past week, their marriage, their hopes for the future, their very lives would be decided in the next few minutes. The first phase of Jacob's plan was psychological warfare. Instead of attacking the hotel directly, he'd spent the early morning hours eliminating the hired guns' horses and cutting off their escape routes. Professional killers were like wolves, dangerous when cornered, but always calculating the odds of survival. By removing their mobility, Jacob was forcing them to either fight on his terms or surrender. The sound of men shouting from the hotel's stable told them the first part had worked. Marcus's hired guns had discovered their dead horses and realized they were trapped in a town with limited cover and no easy way out. "Hartwell," a voice called from the hotel's second floor. "We know you're out there. This doesn't have to end in blood." Jacob smiled grimly. The fact that they were trying to negotiate meant they were already rattled. Professional killers didn't usually bother with conversation unless they were looking for an advantage. "It ended in blood the moment Thornfield put a price on my wife's head," Jacob called back. "But I'm willing to discuss terms." A brief silence followed. Then the same voice replied, "What terms?" "Simple," Jacob shouted. "You and your men ride out of town within the hour, and I let you live. Stay, and I'll kill every last one of you." Harsh laughter echoed from the hotel. "You're outnumbered 6-1, Hartwell. Those aren't odds that favor negotiation." Jacob had been counting on that response. Professional killers lived by reputation, and backing down from a single uneven one with Jacob's background would damage their standing in a community that valued violence above all else. "Sarah May," Jacob said quietly, "it's time." Sarah May struck a match and lit the fuse on the bundle of dynamite Jacob had prepared, then rolled it carefully toward the hotel's front porch. The fuse was cut long enough to give them time to reach better cover, but short enough that the men inside wouldn't have time to defuse it or throw it back. The explosion shattered the morning quiet like thunder, sending splinters of wood and broken glass flying through the air. The hotel's front porch collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris, and screams of pain from inside told them that at least some of the hired guns had been caught in the blast. Jacob was moving before the dust settled, rifle in hand as he sprinted toward the damaged building. This was the crucial moment, the seconds immediately after an explosion when survivors were disoriented and vulnerable. He'd learned during the war that battles were often won in these brief windows of chaos. A figure appeared in one of the hotel's broken windows, rifle raised and searching for targets. Jacob's shot took the man in the chest, spinning him backward into the darkness of the building's interior. One down, at least 5 to go. Sarah May was right behind him, staying low and scanning for threats from other directions. She spotted movement in the alley beside the hotel too, men trying to circle around and catch Jacob in a crossfire. Her warning shout gave Jacob time to dive for cover as bullets whined through the space where he'd been standing. The battle descended into chaos as the surviving hired guns tried to organize a defense from inside the damaged building. They were professionals, but they'd been caught off guard and were fighting from a compromised position. Jacob used his knowledge of military tactics to keep them off balance, never attacking from the same angle twice and never giving them time to coordinate their response. A window on the hotel's second floor exploded outward as one of the hired guns tried to escape through it. The man hit the ground hard but rolled to his feet, gun in hand and eyes searching for targets. Sarah May's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and buying Jacob time to finish him with a more precise bullet. "Good shooting," Jacob called to his wife as he reloaded behind an overturned water trough. "Don't sound so surprised," Sarah May replied, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of violence. The sound of splintering wood from inside the hotel told them that the survivors were trying to break through the back wall and escape into the alley. Jacob had anticipated this and prepared for it. Several sticks of dynamite, strategically placed around the building's perimeter, would channel any escape attempts into a killing ground he could control. Marcus Thornfield's voice suddenly cut through the chaos, calling from somewhere inside the hotel. "Enough! I want to parley!" Jacob felt a cold smile cross his face. Marcus had finally realized that his hired protection was failing him, and now he wanted to negotiate from a position of weakness. "Come out with your hands empty and visible," Jacob shouted back. "Any tricks and I'll bring the rest of the building down on your head." A long moment passed. Then Marcus Thornfield emerged from the hotel's side door, his hands raised and his face pale with fear and rage. Behind him came 2 of his surviving hired guns, both wounded and clearly ready to surrender rather than continue a fight they couldn't win. But Jacob's years of experience had taught him to watch for deception, even in apparent surrender. As Marcus stepped into the open, Jacob caught a glint of metal from the man's sleevier hidden derringer, small but deadly at close range. "Gun!" Sarah May shouted, having spotted the same threat. Jacob dove sideways as Marcus brought the concealed weapon up, the small pistol cracking as it discharged. The bullet buzzed past Jacob's ear like an angry wasp, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. The treachery ended any possibility of negotiation. Jacob's rifle spoke once, the heavy bullet taking Marcus Thornfield center mass and dropping him to the dusty street like a felled tree. The man who had terrorized Sarah May's family and bought judges and sheriffs lay still in the morning light, his schemes and cruelties finally ended. The 2 surviving hired guns looked at their dead employer, then at Jacob's rifle, and made the intelligent choice. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands, clearly indicating their desire to surrender rather than continue fighting for a man who could no longer pay them. "It's over," Jacob said, though he kept his rifle trained on the surrendering men. "The threat is ended." But as the dust settled and the town's residents began to emerge from their hiding places, both Jacob and Sarah May knew that while this particular battle was won, the war for their future was just beginning. Marcus Thornfield's death would have consequences that reached far beyond Cedar Creek, and they would need to be ready for whatever came next. The immediate aftermath of the gunfight brought an eerie quiet to Cedar Creek's main street. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight that slanted through the smoke, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Jacob kept his rifle trained on the 2 surviving hired guns, while Sarah May moved carefully through the debris, checking for any other threats. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from his office across the street, his badge glinting in the sunlight and his face grim with the knowledge that he'd have to deal with the political consequences of Marcus Thornfield's death. Jacob knew Bradley by reputation an honest man, trying to do a difficult job in a territory where money too often trumped justice. "Jacob Hartwell," Bradley said as he approached, his own gun drawn but not immediately threatening. I heard you were dead. Reports of my demise were greatly exaggerated, Jacob replied, not lowering his rifle. These men were hired killers sent to murder my wife and me. I was defending myself and my family. Bradley's eyes moved from Jacob to Sarah May, taking in her torn dress, the revolver in her hand, and the way she positioned herself to cover Jacob's flank. This, the Thornton girl, everyone's been looking for. Sarah May Hartwell, Jacob corrected. My lawfully wedded wife, married 3 days ago in front of witnesses. The sheriff's eyebrows rose at that information. The legal implications were significant if Jacob and Sarah May were truly married. It changed the entire dynamic of what had appeared to be a kidnapping case. That true, ma'am? Bradley asked Sarah May directly. Yes, Sheriff. I married Jacob of my own free will to escape a forced marriage to a man who'd already killed 2 wives. Sarah May's voice was steady, despite the violence she'd just witnessed. Marcus Thornfield was trying to claim ownership of me through a fraudulent contract. Bradley holstered his gun and moved closer to examine Marcus's body. The man who'd terrorized half the territory with his wealth and influence looked surprisingly small in death, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky. You realize this is going to bring a world of trouble down on both of you, Bradley said quietly. Thornfield had friends in high places, judges and politicians who owe him favors. They're not going to let his death pass without investigation. Let them investigate, Jacob replied. Everything we did was legal and justified. Thornfield hired these men to commit murder, and when that failed, he tried to kill me himself with a concealed weapon. As if to prove Jacob's point, one of the wounded hired guns spoke up from where he sat against the hotel's damaged wall. It's true, Sheriff. Thornfield hired us to kill Hartwell and bring the woman back alive. When we couldn't do it clean, he ordered us to burn them out and make it look like an accident. The confession was a gift Jacob hadn't expected. Having one of Thornfield's own men testify to the murderous intent behind the attack would make it much harder for any corrupt officials to paint Jacob as the aggressor. Why should I believe you? Bradley asked the wounded gunman. The man laughed bitterly, wincing as the movement pulled at his shoulder wound. Because Thornfield's dead and can't pay us anymore. No point in protecting a corpse, especially when the alternative is hanging for murder conspiracy. Sarah May knelt beside Marcus's body and began searching through his pockets, her face set in lines of grim determination. Jacob watched her with concern, knowing that handling the dead could be traumatic for someone not accustomed to violence. What are you looking for? He asked. The contract he claimed gave him legal rights to me, Sarah May replied, continuing her methodical search. And any other documents that might explain how he manipulated my father into debt. She found what she was looking for in Marcus's inside coat pocketer leather portfolio containing multiple legal documents, financial papers, and correspondence. As she rifled through them, her expression grew increasingly angry. Jacob, look at this, she said, holding up a series of letters. Marcus was corresponding with gambling house operators, arranging for my father to be extended unlimited credit. He was deliberately encouraging Papa's addiction to create the debt that would force the marriage contract. The letters provided clear evidence of a conspiracy to defraud Sarah May's family and force her into an unwanted marriage. Combined with the testimony of the surviving hired guns, it painted a picture of Marcus Thornfield as a predator who used legal manipulation and violence to acquire what he wanted. Sheriff Bradley examined the document Sarah May had found, his expression growing grimmer with each page. This is enough evidence to clear you both of any wrongdoing, he said finally. But like I said, Thornfield had powerful friends. Some of them might not care about evidence if it conflicts with their interests. Then we'll deal with them as they come, Jacob said, finally lowering his rifle as the immediate danger passed. I'm tired of running from other people's corruption. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the end of the street, where a group of well-dressed men on expensive mounts was riding into town. Jacob recognized several faces, among them territorial officials, wealthy ranchers, and at least one federal judge. Marcus Thornfield's death had apparently brought his political allies out of the woodwork faster than expected. "Jacob Hartwell," called the lead rider, a portly man with a territorial marshal's badge pinned to his expensive coat. "You're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Thornfield." "On whose authority?" Sheriff Bradley demanded, stepping forward to assert his jurisdiction. "Federal authority," the marshal replied, producing a warrant from his coat. "This is a territorial matter now, involving interstate commerce and federal jurisdiction." Jacob felt Sarah May tense beside him as she recognized what was happening. Thornfield's allies were moving quickly to control the narrative and ensure that justice didn't interfere with their interests. "That warrant's not worth the paper it's written on," Jacob said loudly, addressing not just the marshal but the growing crowd of townspeople who'd gathered to watch the confrontation. "And everyone here knows it. Thornfield was a criminal who used violence and fraud to prey on innocent families. His death was justified, self-defense." The marshal's face flushed with anger. "You'll have your chance to present that defense at trial. Right now, you're coming with us." But before the marshal could order his men to advance, Sarah May stepped forward, holding up the portfolio of documents she'd taken from Marcus's body. "Actually," she said clearly, "I think everyone here should see exactly what kind of man Marcus Thornfield really was before you start arresting the people who stopped him." She began reading from the letters aloud, her voice carrying clearly across the street as she detailed Thornfield's conspiracy to manipulate her father into debt and force an unwanted marriage. The crowd listened with growing murmurs of anger and disgust as the full scope of Thornfield's predatory behavior was revealed. When Sarah May finished reading, she held up the fraudulent marriage contract and tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like dead leaves. "This is what I think of Marcus Thornfield's legal claims," she declared, "and this is what I think of any man who would try to arrest my husband for defending us from a criminal conspiracy." The crowd's murmur grew into angry shouts as the people of Cedar Creek realized how thoroughly they'd been manipulated by Thornfield's money and influence. Several men stepped forward to stand beside Jacob and Sarah May, making it clear that any attempt to arrest them would face resistance from the entire community. The territorial marshal looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him and seemed to recalculate his options. Federal authority meant little when faced with an entire town ready to defend their own sense of justice. "This isn't over," the marshal said finally, clearly frustrated by the turn of events. "Yes, it is," Jacob replied firmly. "Marcus Thornfield is dead, his conspiracy is exposed, and his hired killers are in custody. Justice has been served, whether his corrupt friends like it or not." As the marshal and his men rode out of town, defeated by the simple power of truth spoken in front of honest people, Jacob and Sarah May stood together in the morning sunlight, surrounded by neighbors who'd chosen right over might. The immediate threat was over, but they both knew that Thornfield's death had created as many new challenges as it had solved. Still, for the first time since this ordeal began, they faced those challenges not as fugitives or victims, but as a married couple with the law and their community on their side. 6 months later, Sarah May stood in the doorway of their new cabin, watching Jacob work in the garden they'd planted together. The structure was larger than his old hermit's retreat, built to accommodate a family and the life they were building together. Sunlight filtered through the pines that surrounded their homestead, and the sound of a creek running nearby provided a peaceful counterpoint to the rhythm of Jacob's hoe. The aftermath of Marcus Thornfield's death had proven less complicated than they'd feared. The evidence Sarah May had found in his papers had led to a territorial investigation that uncovered a web of corruption reaching from local judges to territorial officials. Several of Thornfield's political allies had been removed from office, and the legal challenges to Jacob and Sarah May's marriage had quietly disappeared as prosecutors focused on bigger fish. Sarah May's family situation had also resolved better than expected. With Marcus dead and his fraudulent debts exposed, her father had been cleared of criminal charges in exchange for his testimony about Thornfield's manipulation. The gambling addiction that had made him vulnerable to Marcus's schemes was being addressed with the help of a church group in town, and while their relationship remained strained, there was hope for eventual reconciliation. Her sister Emma had visited twice, and Sarah May had been relieved to see the 14-year-old growing into a strong, independent young woman who wouldn't easily fall victim to the kind of manipulation their family had endured. Emma was even learning to read and write properly, something their parents had never prioritized for their daughters. "The corn's coming along well," Jacob said as he approached the cabin, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Should have a good harvest this fall." Sarah May smiled at the simple contentment in his voice. The man who'd once believed himself unworthy of peace had found it in the rhythm of honest work and the comfort of love freely given. The scars were still there, both visible and hidden, but they no longer defined him. "There's something I need to tell you," Sarah May said, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. Jacob's eyes followed the gesture, and understanding dawned in his expression like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Are you certain?" "As certain as a woman can be. Doc Peterson confirmed it yesterday when I rode into town for supplies." Sarah May watched Jacob's face, seeing joy and wonder and fear chase each other across his features. "A baby," Jacob breathed, as if saying the words might make them disappear. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah May asked, though she could already see the answer in his eyes. Jacob's response was to sweep her into his arms and spin her around, both of them laughing with the pure joy of it. When he set her down, his hands moved to frame her face with the gentleness she'd come to love. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said softly. "Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful beyond words, but yes, deeply, completely happy." They sat together on the porch steps they'd built themselves, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across their land. The wooden bird Jacob had carved for Sarah May sat on the windowsill nearby, a reminder of how far they'd traveled from that desperate night when she'd knocked on a stranger's door. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked quietly, "choosing this life over what you could have had?" Sarah May considered the question seriously. She could have had comfort and security if she'd submitted to her family's plans, could have lived in a fine house with servants and social standing, but she would have bought those luxuries with her freedom and quite possibly her life. "What could I have had that would be better than this?" she asked in return. "A home built with love instead of money? A husband who sees me as a partner rather than property? Children who'll grow up knowing they're valued for who they are, rather than what they can bring to a marriage contract?" Jacob's smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "I love you, Sarah May Hartwell, more than I thought possible, more than I deserve to find again. And I love you, Jacob Hartwell. All of you, the gentleman who carves wooden birds, and the fierce protector who fights for what's right, and even the broken soldier who thinks he's unworthy of happiness." As evening painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat together planning for the future they were building. There would be challenges. Ahead, raising children on the frontier was never easy, and the political consequences of Marcus Thornfield's downfall would ripple through the territory for years to come. But they would face those challenges together, as partners in every sense of the word. The little wooden bird on the windowsill caught the last rays of sunlight, its wings spread as if ready to take flight toward whatever adventures waited on the horizon. Sarah May had learned that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came from the darkest moments, that love could bloom even in the hardest ground if tended with patience and watered with hope. Inside the cabin, two simple gold wedding bands sat on the mantelpiece rings Jacob had hammered from nuggets he'd found in their creek, shaped by his own hands as a symbol of the commitment they'd forged in fire and sealed with trust. They were imperfect circles, slightly uneven and bearing the marks of amateur craftsmanship, but they were infinitely more precious than any store-bought jewelry because they represented something that couldn't be purchased or commanded. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah May leaned against her husband's shoulder and thought about the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, She'd been a sheltered girl whose greatest concern was avoiding unwanted attention at church socials. Now she was a woman who'd faced down hired killers, outwitted corrupt officials, and chosen her own destiny, despite overwhelming pressure to submit. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there were still nights when she woke from dreams of what might have happened if Jacob hadn't answered his door that desperate evening. But those fears were balanced by the certain knowledge that she'd found something rare and precious in this remote valley of love that was freely chosen and freely given. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared strength. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. Their child would grow up in a world that was slowly changing, where women like Sarah May were beginning to claim voices that had too long been silenced, where men like Jacob were learning that true strength lay in protection rather than domination. It wouldn't be a perfect world, but it would be a better one. And in this quiet corner of the Montana Territory, in a cabin built with love and defended with courage, two people who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances continued to prove that some things love, integrity, the determination to choose right over easy, were worth any sacrifice. The wooden bird on the windowsill seemed to nod in the evening breeze, its wings forever spread toward a future bright with possibility.